We simply cannot allow people to pour into the United States undetected, undocumented, unchecked.
And complete the dang fence.
This bill that we will sign today is not a revolutionary bill.
Cast down your bucket where you are.
We come from France.
And I am, adamantly against illegal immigrants.
They're coming in by the thousands, just unbelievable.
A wall is an immorality.
Who are you rooting for? Those masters of the universe are at it again.
You maniac! You blew it up!
Welcome to Parsing Immigration Policy, the podcast of the Center for Immigration Studies. My name is Mark Krikorian, Executive Director of the Center. And today we're going to talk about some information that we extracted from the government at the gavel point, I guess you could say. In other words, through litigation. And it's interesting and has some important policy implications and consequences. And here to talk about it is Todd Bensman of the Center, who has been all over this particular issue and the Freedom of Information Act request we filed and the lawsuit we filed. He's been all over it like Inspector Bookman in Seinfeld said, "I'll be all over you like a pit bull on a poodle." And he's been all over DHS like a pit bull on a poodle to get this information. And so, Todd, thanks for joining us. And before we get into the specific information that we got this last batch and what it is and why it's important, in general, what was this issue? What is the program, this Cuban Haitian Nicaraguan Venezuelan program, and what information were they not giving out that we had to try to extract from them?
Right. Well, this is one of two major parole programs, humanitarian parole programs, that the administration, I guess, invented out of whole cloth. Nobody's ever done one of these before, that enables people who would have crossed the southern border illegally, who wanted to, were aspiring to do that, to, instead of adding to all the congestion down there, apply for their illegal entries, like officially, to be brought in one of two ways, which is by land over the land ports, 8 of them to be specific. And the second parole program was a flights program where you could apply to fly into the United States from a third other country, maybe your own country. These are not insignificant programs. Between the two of them, probably about 1 million foreign nationals have been brought into the United States sight unseen on something called parole, which is like a temporary residence. Not really, it's not residence, it's not permanent residence, but it's like a temporary protected status for 2 years that comes with a work authorization, and it's renewable, supposedly.
Right. Just to be clear for listeners, you talked about the two parts. The parole program for people just coming to the border, the land border, that's what uses the CBP-1 app, and that's gotten some attention where you schedule your illegal immigration at a land port of entry across the Rio Grande or one of the other ones on the Mexican border. What we're talking about is the other part, which is this, as you said, this direct flights program, which mainly, almost exclusively involves Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans, people from those 4 nationalities, and lets them, as you said, even though they're not admissible, they don't have visas, they get an okay to come in for some kind of humanitarian reason and fly over the border straight into the United States.
Right, and we think this is legally dubious. There is litigation. A lot of red states are suing over this thing, but it's working its way very slowly through the courts. And in the meantime, something on the order of 460,000 people have been authorized to fly into the United States under this program. It's a major program. That's a lot of people. And we wanted to know where they were flying them into, because major American cities were complaining, the mayors staggering under the fiscal burden of all of these immigrants who were showing up, hands out.
Who were showing up in a variety of ways, not just through this program, but every other way they were getting into the country.
That's right. But this was one of the ways, but nobody was really talking about it because they weren't telling us where they were landing. So we put in a FOIA. They didn't want to tell us where they were landing. We sued, as you know, and we began to, over a long period of time, eke out bits and pieces of information. We never did really get the specific airport locations, even to this day, but the House Homeland Security Committee got that information and released it. So we know 45 cities across the nation and in what numbers that they were showing up. Okay, great. Now we know where they're showing up, but we still wanted to know where they were departing from. The administration was just adamant about not releasing that. They just fought tooth and nail over releasing the departure countries.
And I think the important point here is the reason they would have done that is because the public perception, and just really any perception, common sense would suggest, well, if it's Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans that are being offered this opportunity to come here, and the whole program's illegal, but the point is it applied to those four nationalities, everybody would kind of assume, it was sort of unspoken, that, well, of course they were flying from those four countries, right? In other words, Haiti's really bad, so people were coming from Haiti. And Venezuela's a mess, so they were coming from Venezuela. The very fact that they were so resistant into telling us what countries they came from, I assume, given your both journalistic and intelligence background, immediately kind of had your spidey sense tingling that there's got to be something interesting there.
Yes, that's exactly right, because nobody had to guess really about why they were doing this program. They sold it to the American public on the front end as a humanitarian rescue program, that these people from these nationalities had an urgent humanitarian need to be able to fly into the United States to get away from terrible situations. And also that there was an overriding American public interest in this, which they named in their public documents as reducing the congestion at the land borders. So we should get them out of their terrible straits, make sure that they don't have to get on these dangerous trails, maybe get killed along the way, and at the same time help America by reducing congestion at the border. So now we finally come to a settlement on our lawsuit that includes a provision to release the names of the countries, the departing countries. They give those countries to us. They won't tell us how many are leaving from each of these countries or even rank them in order of volume or anything like that, just an alphabetical list.
Right.
And it turns out that there were 77 countries. And when you start going through the list, you're seeing that the vast majority of them are like perfectly safe and nowhere near the migrant trails that they would be forced onto by their terrible straits.
Sure. And just to be clear, it's the vast majority of countries because they wouldn't give us numbers. So, clearly a lot of the Cubans would have come from Cuba and the Nicaraguans from Nicaragua. But there's 73 other countries that they're coming from, and most of them are not places any of these people are being persecuted.
Exactly. And to just name some of the countries, France, Germany, Iceland, Fiji, Australia, Canada. Right. These are places that are safe countries that immigrants all over the world try to bust the borders to get to and to stay there because they're prosperous and safe and orderly. And they're certainly nowhere near migrant trails where something so bad in Iceland was happening that they'd have to go to the Mexican through Tapachula or through the Darien Gap or something. And other countries are also perfectly safe and far away, like South Korea and Taiwan and even China. Really strange, like places that you would never think that Cubans need to get rescued from or Haitians need to be rescued from. And I guess the big takeaway of the list and of having this information is that the administration is, I'm just going to say, I mean, they were lying about the need for all the justifications for this program. They're just flat out lying about it, in my opinion. Certainly being extremely disingenuous about, and I mean in public forums, in speech, in talk, and in the proposed regulations, all of it is saying we're gonna kind of give these people safe haven from their urgent humanitarian straits.
Right.
And it turns out that none of that, or maybe some of it's true, but nobody's explaining why we're rescuing Cubans, Haitians, and Venezuelans, from Fiji.
Yeah. Or Austria or Switzerland, or I'm looking at the list of countries: Italy, Finland, Sweden, Brazil, South Korea, Taiwan. I mean, it's ludicrous. The United Arab Emirates, even. The whole thing is preposterous. And it really does, I mean, what it undermines is this idea that there was an urgent humanitarian need for this program to begin with. And you also highlighted in the post you did on this, which we'll have the link in the show notes. It's on our website at CIS.org with the list of countries, all kinds of vacation spots. It wasn't just Fiji, but, Bahamas and St. Lucia, St. Kitts and Nevis, all kinds of places where none of these people were being persecuted. There was no urgent humanitarian need for these people to come to the U.S. to claim asylum, because that's kind of the rationale here, is that they're being let in on this so-called temporary parole, which everybody knows is de facto permanent, in order to apply for asylum and be allowed to stay because they're supposedly fleeing these terrible conditions.
That's right. And we're looking at something like, I mentioned 460,000, and that grows by 30,000 plus a month of those four nationalities. So this thing is ongoing. Whoever in the White House or the DHS designed this thing had to have had in mind something else. We can only guess at what that is. I did put in requests for comment to have somebody come and explain this. I emailed that in, have not heard anything back.
You mean explain the rationale why people coming from other countries were allowed in?
Exactly. And I probably, if I could have had somebody in front of me, I would have asked point blank, can you reconcile your public justifications for this massive program, this huge hundreds of thousands of people program, with the reality that you're flying a great many of them, we don't know how many, from perfectly safe places? And what's really going on here? Who did this and why? We can only speculate, but I quote Elizabeth Jacobs here at the center, who's quite the expert on this and comes from USCIS, who I think had the best explanation yet, which is that this is a hidden immigrant admissions program that they didn't want to tell anybody about. They just want to bring in hundreds of thousands of people without having to go through Congress to statutorily declare a new admissions program. And that's what this is. And I think that the American people, if they're interested in this, or they ever want to know what happened, this pretty much puts a lie to everything that the American public has been told so far about this flights program. And I also now kind of get why they fought so hard against releasing this information, because frankly, if I were them, I'd be a little bit embarrassed about this. You're busted. You're just busted.
To reinforce the idea that this was a way to use this supposedly narrow parole power as just a way of goosing more generic immigration, people coming in on this program, and just to be clear, they have to buy their own plane tickets. A lot of people got that wrong. They're not flown in by the U.S. government. But people coming in have to have a sponsor in the United States, have to have somebody requesting that they come here. And so it's basically just a way of getting around the limits, not just the limits on immigration in general, but the waiting lists for family categories. So if, you're some relative of somebody who's in the U.S. and you're a Cuban, you may have to wait several years on a waiting list to be able to get in. This way you can just skip the line, cut in line, and come directly here with this through what's supposed to be in a narrow emergency program called parole, and bingo, you're in the United States, and the administration will have de facto increased legal immigration by hundreds of thousands a year. So far, this program, what is it, about a year and a half worth, has taken in almost 500,000 people. The administration just increases immigration without, like you said, without getting any approval from Congress. It's just one more example of this administration essentially trying to make up immigration law on its own and, frankly, at least so far, getting away with it.
Right. One of the issues we talked about internally, you and I and others is, why are all these Cubans in Iceland and, all these strange places around the world? And there's an answer for that. It's that Cubans and Haitians and Nicaraguans they're not just trying to come to the United States. They're trying to go to any prosperous country where they can live and work and have a better lifestyle, et cetera. And we can only guess as to why they would suddenly take advantage of this program as a better option than being in, France or Greece or some of these other places. And I guess the best answer is that they may have run into asylum issues there, or they were having problems legalizing, regularizing in these European countries, and then all of a sudden the Biden administration throws this big lifeline. Well, here you can come to the U.S. All you got to do is get online. And I think probably that's what happened. A lot of them, maybe they had some family in the U.S. that it was an opportunity to reunify. This is not a family reunification program, by the way.
Yeah, well, but it is. That's the point. I mean, I think that's probably the main, I would suspect that's the main explanation. In other words, if you're a Nicaraguan who's working in Vietnam, one of the countries here, or a Venezuelan who managed to get to Norway, but you have relatives in the United States, well, Norway's not so bad. You may even have a job, but if, Joe Biden is inviting you to come in to the United States, you might take him up on it. Why wouldn't you? And then in some other cases, for instance, if you were in Vietnam or the Philippines, or I'm looking at the list of countries here, Kenya or Ivory Coast, you're safe. You're not being persecuted, assuming you even were before, which is dubious. But you can, trade up, because you yourself have told stories about migrants that you've met south of the border who were perfectly fine where they were, but were trading up because Biden offered them the opportunity to do so.
Yeah, this is a case of, if you build it, they will come. And, they built it and they came. So anyway, the cat's kind of out of that bag. I do still hope that the administration will respond. I have a lot of questions about this. I think everybody should have a lot of questions about a public policy program as massive as this one. Absolutely huge. I mean, as long as it goes on, it's bringing in 30,000 of just those four nationalities every single month into American cities that are struggling under the burdens of taking care of them and resettling them.
And that's just this flights program. There's another, about 45,000? About 35,000 who come in through the land ports using that CBP-1 program. Not to mention all the people who just walk across the border, turn themselves in, and get let go. This is a big part, and actually a less reported part, of the administration's attempt at making an end run around immigration limits.
Yeah, and I would want to just note one other thing is, on the last time we've reported on this, we took a lot of flack, and there were fact checkers coming in talking about it's not a secret program. They announced it, so therefore it wasn't secret, and therefore the whole thing of calling it a secret flights program is wrong, as though the flights program wasn't happening, because it's not secret in their view. But I'm just going to have to beg to differ. It absolutely was a secret where these people were flying from that the government fought very hard to maintain.
Right.
It was a secret that the U.S. airports where they were arriving and the U.S. cities where they were arriving that were receiving them, that they fought very hard to protect and to maintain. And departure countries and arrival airports are like the bread and butter, the meat and potatoes of the whole thing.
Right.
So the whole thing was pretty much secret, other than that it existed.
Yep. And actually, that's worth reemphasizing the reason they gave you, not for the departure countries, because unless correct me if I'm wrong here, but they didn't actually give us a reason they were withholding the departure countries. But the reason they wouldn't tell us what airports people were flying to is because they said, in effect, the program was so onerous that it was creating security vulnerabilities at the airports. And so they didn't want to tell anybody where the security vulnerabilities were that they themselves were creating through this illegal program.
Yeah, that's right. And that was a public interest story in its own right, that they were creating vulnerabilities at our airports. I mean, airport security is like priority one since 9/11, and there they are. But I have to say that as far as the flights program, the flights part of this program, there's not much in the way of secrecy around it at all anymore. And I would just give, credit to the Center for the FOIA and fighting the FOIA all the way to the end. This thing is as viewable and visible to the public now than maybe it ever will be.
Well, only because you and Colin Farnsworth, our FOIA director, were persistent on this and ultimately had to go to court, file suit to get this information out of them. I got to say, while this last batch of information that we got from them on the departure countries is important for this particular story, it does shed light on the broader issue of who should we be giving asylum to? Not so much in the issue of does a particular person qualify because he's been persecuted on one of these various grounds, but rather, should people even be allowed to apply for asylum if they were already in a country where they weren't being persecuted? And that is a broader issue than just this, but this really does shine a light on it. For instance, if you're, let's say, a Venezuelan and you are in, I'm looking at the list here, you're in Italy and you're, I don't know, working construction or washing dishes or something somewhere, why would you even be permitted to apply for asylum in the United States? Asylum is supposed to be essentially the equivalent of throwing a life preserver to a drowning man. But if you already have a life preserver, why would, even if you want a nicer life preserver, too bad. Asylum is a limitation on our sovereignty, where we say, here are our immigration laws, but you get an exception to them. You get to be let in even though you don't qualify because of the fact that you're being persecuted. That is a very significant exception we're making. And it should only be for people who have no other options. And if you're already living in Sweden or in Israel, or even in, Jordan or Kenya, and, you're from one of these four countries or from any country other than that one, you already have your asylum. Sorry. It just, under our law, you can still apply, but you shouldn't be able to. This is a broader discussion that we need to have of why should anybody be permitted to apply for asylum if they're not, if they came through countries where they weren't being persecuted.
Exactly. And you have to assume that most of those who are already in these other countries have actually applied for asylum in them, and maybe even have been granted asylum in them. And yet here we are extending humanitarian safe haven to people in those circumstances. It's an abuse. It's asylum shopping. It's exposed.
Right.
It's completely exposed what they did.
Right. And actually, I got to say, I think this latest revelation does really underline this whole idea of asylum shopping, because asylum shopping goes on all the time. We did a panel, I think it was last year, with Trump's former ambassador to Mexico, Chris Landau, who's been on this program. And the topic of remain in Mexico came up. I don't want to get too far off the topic here, but Remain in Mexico, if listeners remember, was a program where an illegal immigrant sneaks into the U.S., says he wants asylum. We would say, look, yeah, you get to apply, but you have to wait in Mexico for your hearing date. The point being, we don't let them go and then never see them again. Chris Landau's point, and he was there when Remain in Mexico, he helped negotiate it and everything. He said, look, it was perfectly okay. It was a good idea at the time, but it was a half measure. The real question is, why would anyone who wasn't Mexican be even allowed to pass through Mexico and then apply for asylum at the U.S. border? Mexico has an asylum system. Mexico, in fact, is the number 3 country in the world receiving asylum applications after the U.S. and Germany. And your latest information shows that some of the Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans covered by this actually flew in from Mexico. Well, there's just no excuse for that. Not because it's illegal. It unfortunately is legal, but there's no excuse for the law permitting such a thing to happen. And this administration's really abuse of parole through this flights program, I think really should focus people's attention on the idea of asylum shopping and how outrageous it is.
Right. And my understanding of the asylum law as it stands is that there's nothing in it that specifically prohibits people who have asylum elsewhere from then claiming it in the United States, except for Canada, which there's a specific agreement.
Right.
This really underlines the need for more agreements like that, if not additional like amendments and statutes that could prohibit this sort of thing from happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think statutory change is the way to go. And, that's not going to happen in this administration. But I could see if there were a new administration and a new Congress that changing the asylum law would be a real possibility. And as much as I've said elsewhere and written that we really need to withdraw from the UN Refugee Treaty, in this instance, we wouldn't have to change the law because the UN, it's called the Convention on the Status of Refugees, and we've signed on to the corollary to it called the Protocol. It says that an illegal immigrant can't be denied asylum just because he's illegal. But that only applies if he comes directly from the country where he claims to have been persecuted. And no one passing through Mexico, except Mexicans, can claim that they came directly from the country where they're supposedly being persecuted. And frankly, the people who flew from the 74 other countries in this particular instance can't claim that either. If you're a Nicaraguan flying to, into the U.S. from Portugal, or a Venezuelan going to the U.S. from South Africa under these direct flights programs, you're not coming directly from the country where you're being persecuted. And so even though our asylum law does permit you to apply for asylum, the UN treaty does not mandate that. And so we need to change that regardless of whether we pull out of the treaty. That's a whole other show, but this issue, the information that you uncovered from this direct flights program really does call out for the need to fix our asylum system, something that was a holdover from the Cold War, and the UN rules were written a lifetime ago. And our reform of our interpretation of them and our law is it's long overdue. So thanks for joining us, Todd. I know you're away for family obligations. I hope that all goes well, and thanks for making time for this. And we will include links to the report that we've been talking about here, and that report itself has links to something like a dozen earlier reports that Todd had done on this issue of the direct flights program. Where were these people going? What states? They wouldn't tell us what airports. Where are they coming from? What are the numbers, etc.? That's all there, and it's really to Todd's credit and to Colin Farnsworth, our director of our FOIA program, for forcing the government to make this information public, something they had absolutely no intention of doing until we made them. So thank you, Todd, and we'll have you back if there's more details.
Pretty secret program.
Yep. That's it for this week's episode of Parsing Immigration Policy. Like I said, the reports that we talked to Todd about are on our website, CIS.org. They will have a link in the show notes. If there's anything you liked or disliked about this show, please let us know. Email us at center@cis.org. I want to thank our producer, again, Brian Griffith, for his Herculean efforts in getting this program out every week. But there's an exception to that because next week is 4th of July, and we are taking a break for 4th of July. So go out there and celebrate our nation's independence and grill some hamburgers, but you don't have to worry about what's going on in immigration policy. But we will be back the following week with more of Parsing Immigration Policy. Thank you, and enjoy your Independence Day.